My son emptied my bank account and traveled with his wife and mother-in-law. 3 days later my son called me crying, "What did you do? I hate you." My revenge was... Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now let me tell you my story. The Sunday dinner was a carefully orchestrated performance, and my elegant Atlanta home was the stage. From my seat at the head of the long mahogany dining table I watched the players. The air was thick with the scent of the lemon herb roasted chicken I had prepared, and the even thicker scent of my son's ambition. It was a familiar cloying perfume, one I had been smelling for years. My son Mark was the star of the show. At 36 he was a perfect polished specimen of modern success, at least on the surface. His designer sweatshirt, a complex tapestry of logos and artful distressing, probably cost more than the antique Persian rug beneath our feet. He spoke with the easy, booming confidence of a man who has never known a single day of real struggle, his hands gesturing expansively as he painted a verbal masterpiece of his own brilliance. His wife, Chloe, was his adoring audience and co-star. She was 33, a woman who looked less like a person and more like an Instagram filter brought to life. Her smile was a dazzling high-wattage thing, but it never ever reached her cold, calculating eyes. She sat with her designer handbag placed conspicuously on the empty chair beside her, a silent, leather-bound testament to her priorities. And then there was Brenda, Chloe's mother. Brenda was a louder, more garish version of her daughter, a woman draped in bold, expensive prints and an impressive weight of gold jewelry. She was a stage mother for her daughter's ambition, her eyes darting between Mark's face and mine, gauging reactions, her expression a mixture of fawning admiration for him and a faint, competitive disdain for me. They had descended upon my quiet, orderly home for our monthly dinner, a ritual I had once cherished but had come to view with a kind of weary, anthropological curiosity. They moved through my house, a house filled with the quiet elegance of good art and old books, like tourists in a museum they didn't understand. Their world was loud, new, and disposable. Mine was built to last. I was a retired architect, a woman who had spent a lifetime understanding the importance of a solid foundation. Looking at the three of them, I could see nothing but a facade, a beautiful glittering house of cards. "So the synergy is just incredible, Mom," Mark was saying, leaning forward, his eyes alight with a feverish messianic glow. He was in the final act of his performance, the grand pitch he had been building toward all evening. It's a disruptive tech play in the AI-integrated logistics space. We're talking about a paradigm shift in supply chain management. The scalability is off the charts. He threw around buzzwords like confetti, creating a dazzling but ultimately meaningless cloud of corporate jargon. I had spent years advising tech startups on their infrastructure. I knew this world far better than he could imagine, and I knew he was speaking nonsense. He was reciting a script he had memorized, a script designed to impress a woman he believed was a simple, financially naive retiree. "He's been working so hard on this, Sarah," Chloe chimed in, her voice a soft, supportive purr. She placed her perfectly manicured hand on his arm. "He's barely slept. He just believes in it so much." "The returns are going to be astronomical," Brenda added, her eyes glittering with a greedy, vicarious light. Mark was showing us the projections. "Just astronomical. Think of what you could do with that. Sarah, you could finally get this old house redecorated. Get some modern furniture in here." I smiled, a gentle, placid smile that revealed nothing. "It sounds very exciting, Mark, but I'm just a retired old woman. What does this have to do with me?" This was his cue. He took a deep breath, his expression shifting from that of a visionary CEO to one of a humble, loving son. "Mom," he said, his voice dropping to a low, sincere tone, "I've been given an opportunity, a once-in-a-lifetime chance. The main investors have offered me a seat at the table, a real partnership stake, but I have to secure my position. I need to come in with a seed investment. It's the final piece of the puzzle." He paused, letting the dramatic weight of his statement settle. "I need a loan, Mom," he said, his eyes locking with mine. "A short-term one, just to show them I'm serious. $250,000. The number, as obscene as it was, didn't shock me. I had been expecting it. This entire dinner, the compliments on my cooking, the feigned interest in my gardening, it had all been the preamble to this single transactional moment. I looked at their three expectant faces, a united front of avarice. They saw me as a means to an end. a dusty, old-fashioned piggy bank to be broken open for their shiny new ambitions. They had no idea about the true scope of my finances, about the tech portfolios I had managed, about the quiet, multi-million-dollar fortune I had built and curated with an architect's precision. My quiet life was a deliberate choice, a fortress of solitude I had built to protect myself from the grasping, shallow world they so desperately wanted to conquer. And in that moment, I made a decision. I had been wrestling with it for months, watching my son drift further and further away into this world of performative wealth and moral bankruptcy. I had to know. I had to know if there was anything left of the little boy I had raised, or if he had been completely consumed by the man he was pretending to be. It was time for a final painful test. A structural integrity test for the soul of my son. I let the silence in the room stretch. A tactic I had learned long ago in tense boardroom negotiations. I watched them, my expression a carefully constructed mask of maternal concern and slight, dottery confusion. I saw the flicker of impatience in Chloe's eyes, the greedy anticipation in Brenda's, the nervous sweat bead forming on my son's brow. He thought my silence was hesitation, a sign of a small mind grappling with a large number. He couldn't begin to comprehend the complex, cold calculations that were happening behind my placid facade. "Oh, Mark," I finally said, my voice a soft, frail thing. I shook my head slowly, as if overwhelmed. $250,000. That's an awful lot of money, sweetheart. That's practically my entire life savings. This was the first lie, the foundation stone of the elaborate structure I was about to build. My life savings as they understood it was a fiction, a carefully curated and deliberately modest pot of money I had set aside for this very purpose. "I know it is, Mom," Mark said, his voice taking on a soothing, condescending tone, the kind one uses with a frightened child. "But it's not a gift. It's an investment. A loan. I'll pay you back double within a year. Triple. Maybe. The projections are solid." "It's just so much," I continued, playing my part to perfection. I looked around my elegant, comfortable living room at the art I had collected over a lifetime, at the first edition books that lined the shelves. "Everything I have is tied up in this house, my pension, but I do have that one savings account, the one your father and I opened for a rainy day." This was the second lie, the keystone of the entire plan. The account was real. It was a high-yield savings account at a private, exclusive bank downtown. But it was not for a rainy day. It was a trap, and I had been funding it for years, a little at a time, like a spider patiently spinning its web. A new, sharper light came into their eyes. They smelled money. "That's perfect, Mom," Mark said. A little too quickly. "That's exactly what we need. Just a short-term transfer to show proof of funds." "I don't know, Mark," I fretted, wringing my hands in a gesture of elderly anxiety I had practiced in front of a mirror. "I'm not good with all that online banking. It's so confusing. All the passwords and numbers." "Don't you worry about a thing, Sarah," Chloe said, her voice dripping with a false saccharine sweetness. She shot a triumphant look at her mother. "Mark can handle all of that for you. He's a genius with this stuff. You won't have to do a thing." "I suppose," I said, my voice a whisper of capitulation. I looked at my son, my handsome, charming, predatory son, and I made a show of my maternal heart winning the battle over my sensible head. "You're my son, Mark. I trust you. Of course I'll help you." The wave of relief that washed over the three of them was so powerful it was almost a physical force. It was a disgusting, beautiful thing to behold. Brenda let out a small, triumphant squeal. Chloe's smile for the first time almost looked genuine, and Mark looked like a man who had just pulled off the heist of the century. He came around the table and knelt beside my chair, taking my hands in his. His hands were soft, uncalloused. They were not the hands of a man who had ever built anything. "Thank you, Mom," he said, his voice thick with a beautifully performed emotion. "You won't regret this. I promise. I'm going to make you so proud." "I know you will, sweetheart," I said, patting his hand. I went to the small, antique secretary desk in the corner of the room. With a trembling hand that was only half feigned, I pulled out a piece of my personalized stationery and a pen. I carefully, slowly wrote down the name of the bank, the account number, and the login details for the online portal. It was a simple, elegant piece of paper, a death warrant for the relationship I had once had with my son. I folded it neatly and handed it to him. He took it from me with a reverence usually reserved for a holy relic. He looked at the paper, then at me, and his eyes were shining with a pure, unadulterated greed that he mistook for ambition. I'll initiate the transfer first thing in the morning, he said, his voice all business now. It's better if it comes directly from my end. Cleaner. They didn't stay long after that. They had what they came for. The performance was over. They showered me with hugs and air kisses at the door, their affections a flurry of triumphant insincere gestures. We love you, Sarah. We'll call you from the road, Mom. You're the best, Mom. The absolute best. I stood at the door and watched them get into Mark's leased luxury SUV, a car I now knew was being paid for by my money. I watched as they drove away, their laughter echoing in the quiet suburban street. When they were gone, I closed the door and leaned against it. The silence of my home a sudden, crushing weight. The architect in me saw the clean, elegant lines of the trap I had just set, but the mother in me felt a profound, soul-deep sorrow. I had given my son a choice. A clear, unambiguous choice between his integrity and $250,000. I had just handed him the tools to prove who he truly was, and in my heart, with a certainty that was as cold and as solid as a block of granite, I already knew the choice he was going to make. The next morning I woke before dawn, a habit from a lifetime of early starts and long work days. The house was still and quiet, the air cool and full of the soft gray light of a new day. I did not feel rested. I had spent the night in a fitful, shallow sleep, haunted by images of my son as a little boy, a smiling, gap-toothed child with scraped knees and a heart full of uncomplicated love. Where had that boy gone? When had he been replaced by the smiling, predatory stranger who had sat at my dining table? I made my coffee, the familiar, comforting ritual a small anchor in the turbulent sea of my emotions. I didn't want to do what I was about to do. I wanted to be wrong. I wanted to log into that bank account and see the full balance still sitting there untouched. I wanted to believe that my son, at the final critical moment, had chosen to be the man I had raised him to be. It was a foolish maternal hope, the last flickering ember of a fire that was about to be extinguished for good. I carried my coffee into my study, the room where I had built my career, where I had architected my fortune. It was my sanctuary, a place of logic, order and quiet power. I sat down at my large, uncluttered desk, the leather of my chair cool against my skin. I took a slow, deliberate sip of coffee and turned on my computer. The screen came to life, and I navigated to the online portal of the private bank. This was not my primary wealth management portal, the complex multi-layered interface I used to manage my real fortune. This was the simple, clean consumer-facing site for the decoy account, the rainy day fund. My fingers, steady and sure, typed in the login credentials. The same credentials that were now in my son's possession. The page loaded and the account summary appeared on the screen. I stared at the number displayed in a large bold font at the top of the page. The 0 was a perfect, elegant and utterly brutal void. It was a black hole that had swallowed the last of my hope. I felt a strange sense of detachment, a clinical coldness. The mother in me was screaming, but the architect, the accountant, was simply observing the data. The test was complete, the results were in, and the failure was catastrophic. I scrolled down to the transaction history, my movements slow and methodical. There was only one recent transaction, dated that morning at 6:03 a.m., a wire transfer. The recipient was a personal checking account under the name of Mark A. Jennings, my son. But it was the amount that was the final, vicious twist of the knife. It was not the $50,000 he had asked for. He had not taken the loan for his startup. He had taken everything. He had emptied the account to the very last cent. The total transfer was for $281,472.19. He had been so thorough, so greedy that he had even taken the accrued interest from the last statement period. This wasn't a desperate act to fund a business deal. This was a smash and grab. This was theft, pure and simple. This was a son looting the entirety of what he believed to be his mother's life savings, without a moment's hesitation or a flicker of conscience. The startup investment had been a lie, a flimsy, pathetic story designed to get his hands on the login details. The real plan was always to take it all. I leaned back in my chair, the leather groaning in protest. I looked out the window at my perfectly manicured garden, at the roses just beginning to bloom. The world outside was calm, beautiful, and orderly. It was a world that made sense, but the world of my own family had become a dark, twisted place of lies and betrayal. The pain, when it finally broke through my clinical detachment, was not a hot, fiery rage. It was a cold, creeping numbness that started in my chest and spread through my limbs, leaving me feeling hollowed out, an empty vessel. The son I had loved, The little boy whose memory I had cherished was a ghost. He had been replaced by this stranger, this thief who wore his face. My phone buzzed on the desk beside me. It was a text from Mark. The timing was so perfectly, cruelly ironic that I almost laughed. "Morning, Mom." Transfer went through smoothly. "The team is so excited. Big things are happening. We'll call you later. Love you." The words were a cloud of cheerful, casual lies. A smoke screen to cover his crime. He thought I was a fool. He thought I was a dotty old woman who wouldn't notice the extra $30,000. Who would believe his fairy tales of startups and paradigm shifts. He was so confident in my ignorance. So certain of his own cleverness. The numbness in my chest began to recede, replaced by a new unfamiliar sensation. It was a feeling as cold and as clean as a block of ice. It was the quiet, focused resolve of a woman who had just been handed a declaration of war. My son had made his choice. He had failed the test in the most spectacular way imaginable. The grieving mother was gone. The architect, the strategist, the woman who had built an empire on a foundation of logic and precision, was now in control. My son had just demolished the foundation of our family. It was time for me to show him what happens when you build your life on a foundation of lies. It was time for a controlled demolition, but first I needed to confirm the full scope of his betrayal. I needed to know where my life savings were really going. My first move was not one of panic or anger. It was one of information gathering. The architect in me, the part of my brain that needed to see the full blueprint before starting construction, or in this case demolition, took over. The startup investment was a lie. So what was the truth? Where was my money? And what was it being used for? I knew that a direct confrontation would be useless. Mark was a gifted liar, and he would simply weave a more complex web of deceit. Painting me as a confused, paranoid old woman, I needed to find the truth on my own. In a place where he and his co-conspirators felt safe. A place where their masks were off. In the modern world, that place is almost always social media. I rarely used it myself. I had a Facebook account, mostly to see pictures of old friends' grandchildren, but I was not a part of the constantly curated performative world that my children inhabited. I opened my laptop and navigated to Instagram, a digital landscape I found both fascinating and deeply alienating. I didn't have to search hard. Chloe, my daughter-in-law, had a public profile, a gleaming, highly curated monument to her own perceived fabulousness. Her page was a masterwork of aspirational fiction. Every photo was perfectly lit, perfectly filtered, and perfectly staged. There were photos of her in expensive restaurants, on lavish vacations, wearing clothes I knew for a fact she could not afford on her salary as a part-time yoga instructor. It was a life built on a foundation of my son's debt and my quiet subsidies. I scrolled through the images, a historian studying the artifacts of a fallen empire. And then I saw it. The most recent post, uploaded just 1 hour ago. It was a selfie, a sharp, glamorous photo of Chloe, her face a mask of smug triumph. She was wearing oversized designer sunglasses and holding a glass of champagne, the bubbles catching the light. But it was the background that made my blood run cold. It was unmistakably the first-class lounge of an airport. Through the large window behind her, the tail of a Delta plane was clearly visible. The caption was a masterclass in casual, ostentatious wealth. Aston-bound, hubby surprised me with a spontaneous first-class ski trip. Aston to celebrate some big wins. Aston first class, living my best life. Celebration time. The hashtags were like tiny, vicious little daggers to the heart. Spontaneous, celebration. They had stolen what they believed to be my entire life savings, and their first act was to flaunt it. To celebrate their victory with a luxury vacation. They hadn't even waited for the money to settle in their account. They were so confident, so utterly devoid of conscience, that they were broadcasting their crime to the world. My hands were perfectly steady as I took a screenshot. Evidence. I then navigated to Brenda's page. Chloe's mother was less subtle. Her social media presence a louder, more desperate version of her daughter's. Her most recent post was a blurry photo, clearly taken by someone not quite steady on their feet, of 3 champagne glasses clinking together. In the background, Mark was visible, a wide, triumphant grin on his face. The caption was even more revealing than Chloe's. Off to Aspen with my 2 favorite entrepreneurs to celebrate the deal of a lifetime. So proud of my brilliant son-in-law. The sky's the limit. Family success, Aspen making money moves. The deal of a lifetime, the unmitigated gall of it was breathtaking. They weren't just on vacation, they were a conquering army celebrating the spoils of a war I hadn't even known I was fighting. They had left a trail of digital breadcrumbs, a complete self-incriminating narrative of their crime, all for the world to see. They were so blinded by their own arrogance that they hadn't even considered the possibility that I might be watching. I closed the laptop. The images of their smiling, triumphant faces burned into my memory. The last fragile ember of my maternal love for my son was finally extinguished, leaving behind nothing but cold, hard ash. The quiet sadness I had felt was gone, replaced by a feeling I hadn't experienced in decades. The cold, clean, and utterly focused rage of a woman who has been profoundly and deliberately underestimated. This was no longer a family matter. This was a business transaction that had gone sour, and I was about to become the most ruthless debt collector they had ever met. I picked up my phone, but I didn't call Mark. I didn't call my lawyer. I called the one person in the world who understood the true, vast, and complex architecture of my life. I called my private wealth manager. "James," I said, my voice calm and even, the voice of a CEO about to issue a set of critical, non-negotiable directives. "It's Sarah. We have a situation, and I need you to execute a full structural demolition, immediately." James Sterling had been my wealth manager for over 20 years. He was a sharp, discreet man in his early 50s, with a mind like a steel trap and an unwavering loyalty that I had cultivated and rewarded for 2 decades. He was one of only 2 people in the world, besides my late husband, who knew the true scope of my fortune. He had helped me build it, protect it, and grow it. He was not just an advisor, he was my financial general. He answered on the first ring, his voice the familiar calming baritone I had come to rely on. "Sarah? Good morning, is everything all right?" He could hear the steel in my voice. "No, James," I said, getting straight to the point. "Everything is not all right. The day we've been quietly preparing for has arrived. The Nightingale account has been compromised." There was a brief, loaded silence on his end. The Nightingale account was our code name for the decoy savings account, the loyalty test. We had created it together over a decade ago, a financial firewall designed for this very contingency. "I see," he said, his voice losing all its friendly warmth and taking on a crisp professional edge. "Was the withdrawal partial or total?" "Total," I said, "down to the last cent." The perpetrator was my son Mark. I heard the soft, angry sound of his pen tapping on his desk. James had met my children. He had seen their entitled, grasping nature firsthand at the few family events he had attended with me. He was not surprised. "I'm so sorry to hear that, Sarah," he said, and I knew he meant it, both personally and professionally. "What are your instructions?" This was why I paid James a small fortune. He didn't offer condolences or emotional support. He asked for instructions. He was ready to execute. "First," I said, "I need you to run a full deep dive investigation." The withdrawal was a wire transfer to Mark's personal checking account. I want to know where that money goes next. I want to know the real reason he took it. The story he gave me was a fabrication about a startup. I want the truth. Use all our resources. "Consider it done," he said. "I'll have my forensic team on it within the hour." "What's your second instruction?" "The second instruction," I said, a cold, grim satisfaction settling over me, "is to begin the demolition phase." Code Nightingale wasn't just a pot of money, James. It was an ecosystem. I want you to pull the plug on the entire system, immediately. "With pleasure," he said, and I could hear the quiet professional fury in his voice. "I'll initiate the protocol right now. All co-signed leases, supplementary credit lines, and automated payment authorizations linked to that account as a funding source will be flagged, and the associated institutions will be notified of the primary account's closure. The house of cards should start to fall within 24 hours. "Excellent," I said. "Keep me updated on what your team finds. I want to know the full extent of the damage he intended to cause before I make my next move." We hung up, and for the first time since this ordeal began, I felt a sense of control. The power was shifting. My son, my brilliant, arrogant son, thought he was the master of his own destiny, celebrating his victory in a 5-star resort in Aspen. He had no idea that he was just a puppet, and his mother, the woman he had just robbed and discarded, was the one who was about to cut all his strings. The decoy account had been a work of architectural genius, a financial structure as complex and as carefully designed as any building I had ever created. It was my masterpiece of maternal paranoia. On the surface it looked like a simple high-yield savings account, but beneath the surface it was the load-bearing wall of my son's entire adult life, When Mark had graduated from college, full of ambition but with a terrible credit score, he couldn't get approved for anything on his own. He couldn't get a decent apartment. He couldn't get a car loan. He couldn't even get a major credit card. So I had helped him. I had co-signed the lease on his first high-end condo in Buckhead, listing the Nightingale account as the automatic payment source. I had co-signed the financing for his first luxury SUV, with the same payment arrangement, and when he'd wanted to build his credit, I had authorized 3 high-limit credit cards for him, all of which listed me as the primary account holder and the Nightingale account as the source for the automatic full balance payments he was supposed to be making each month. He had, of course, never made a single payment himself. For years I had quietly allowed the automated systems to pay his rent, his car note, and his staggering credit card bills directly from the account I was funding. He saw the money coming out of his own checking account as a transfer to me, a loan repayment, but it was all a fiction. He was living in a closed loop of my own creation, spending my money to live a life he couldn't afford, and then paying me back with money I had just given him. It was a golden cage, and he had never once bothered to check if the door was locked. Now, with the Nightingale account at a perfect, beautiful zero, that entire automated ecosystem would collapse. The auto-pay for his rent would fail. The payment for his car would be rejected for insufficient funds, and the 3 credit card companies would, upon being notified of the primary account's closure, immediately freeze his cards and call in the entire outstanding balance. He thought he had stolen $250,000. He had no idea he had just torched the very foundation of his entire life. The $250,000 was just the deposit on his own ruin. The real cost was going to be so much higher. The call from James came less than 6 hours later. His team was fast, efficient, and utterly ruthless. "You were right to be suspicious, Sarah," he said, his voice a low, grim hum. "The startup was a complete fabrication. There is no AI-integrated logistics company. The name he gave you doesn't exist. So where is the money going?" I asked. Though I already suspected the answer was something far more selfish and grandiose than a simple vacation. "He was trying to buy a house," James said, and I could almost hear him shaking his head in disbelief on the other end of the line. "Not just any house. A 7-bedroom, 10,000-square-foot monstrosity in the heart of Buckhead, pool, tennis court, wine cellar, the whole 9 yards. It's listed for just under $3 million. I was stunned into silence. A $3 million house. My son, who had never earned more than $100,000 a year in his life, was trying to buy a house fit for a king. He and his wife went into contract on it 2 weeks ago," James continued, his voice all business. "They were in the final stages of closing. The problem was the mortgage. No bank in their right mind would approve a loan of that size for them. Their debt-to-income ratio is a disaster. So, they were trying to get creative." He explained the scheme. Mark and Chloe had applied for the mortgage, but they needed to show the lender a significant amount of liquid assets to prove their financial stability. They also needed to come up with a substantial, non-refundable cash deposit to even secure the contract. "They used your money for both," James concluded, his voice laced with disgust. "The wire transfer for the full $281,000 was sent from Mark's account to an escrow account for the property just this morning. It was their deposit. They had also submitted the statements from your Nightingale account to the mortgage underwriter as their proof of funds. They were pretending your life savings was their own." The sheer breathtaking audacity of it all was almost admirable in its villainy. They hadn't just stolen my money for a ski trip. They had used it as the cornerstone of a massive fraudulent real estate transaction. They were attempting to leverage my life's work into a new life of opulent, unearned luxury. The Aspen trip wasn't a spontaneous celebration. It was their victory lap, a preemptive celebration of the new life they believed they had successfully stolen. "So the mortgage underwriter," I said, a slow, cold, and beautiful idea beginning to form in my mind. "They believe that Mark is a man with $250,000 in liquid assets." "Correct," James said. "It's the primary financial document supporting his entire application." "And what happens," I asked, my voice a soft, dangerous whisper, "when a bank's automated systems perform their final checks and discover that the very same account they have on file as proof of funds was suddenly, completely, and suspiciously emptied just this morning?" There was a pause on James's end, and I could almost hear the grim smile spreading across his face. "A red flag of that magnitude," he said. "It wouldn't just be a denial. It would trigger an automatic fraud investigation. The entire application would be flagged. The deal would be instantly terminated, and he would likely be blacklisted by every major lender in the country. I leaned back in my chair, a feeling of pure architectural satisfaction washing over me. The trap was even more perfect than I had realized. I didn't even have to do anything. The simple logical and automated processes of the financial world would execute my revenge for me. Mark hadn't just stolen the money, he had created a verifiable time-stamped paper trail of his own fraud. So, the house of cards, I murmured, more to myself than to James, is about to come down. He finished, hard. I looked out my window at the calm, orderly beauty of my garden. I had spent my life designing structures that were built to last. Structures with integrity, with solid foundations. My son had built his life on a foundation of lies, sand and my money, and a storm was coming. A storm of his own making, a storm I had simply chosen not to stop. The demolition was about to begin, and I had the best seat in the house. The beauty of the trap was its elegant self-sustaining design. I, the architect, had merely drawn the blueprints years ago. My son, the unwitting demolitions expert, was about to trigger the implosion all by himself. I didn't have to lift another finger. All I had to do was sit back and wait for the laws of financial gravity to take their inevitable course. The blueprint, which James and I had refined over the years, was built on a simple principle: control the source. The Nightingale account was the wellspring from which Mark's entire artificial life flowed. Every luxury, every convenience, every illusion of his success was directly or indirectly fed by that single quiet account. First, there were the credit cards. 3 of them. An American Express Platinum for travel and impressing clients, a Visa Black for everyday expenses, and a high-limit store card for a hideously expensive designer boutique that Chloe favored. On paper they were his cards. In reality they were supplementary cards on my primary account. I was the one who was legally responsible for the debt, and I was the one who had set up the automated full balance payments to be drawn directly from the Nightingale account at the end of each month. Mark saw it as his credit, his purchasing power. He had no idea he was a financial marionette, and I was the one holding the purse strings. With the Nightingale account now a barren digital desert, those payments would not just fail. The card companies would see a primary account holder in default, and they would freeze everything instantly. Then, there was the car, a gleaming new Cadillac Escalade. It was his ultimate status symbol, the chariot of his success. It was, of course, a lease. A very expensive lease, that he could not have qualified for on his own. I had co-signed for it 2 years ago, a decision I now deeply regretted. The automated monthly payments, a staggering sum that made my accountant's heart ache, were also drawn directly from the Nightingale account. The next payment was due in 3 days. The leasing company, a notoriously aggressive and unforgiving financial institution, would receive a payment failed notification, and their response, I knew, would be swift and brutal. Finally, there was the condo, a sleek modern 2-bedroom in a trendy Buckhead high-rise with a rooftop pool and a 24-hour concierge. It was the perfect stage for his performance as a successful startup guru, and just like the car, the lease was co-signed by me. The rent paid automatically from the Nightingale account. The failure of that payment would constitute a breach of contract, and the building's management company, which catered to an exclusive and demanding clientele, would have zero tolerance for such a lapse. Every single pillar that supported his life, his credit, his transportation, his very home, was about to be kicked out from under him. He was a man standing on a trapdoor, and he had just pulled the lever himself. I spent the rest of the day in a state of quiet, detached calm. I did some gardening. I read a few chapters of a new biography. I was a scientist who had set an experiment in motion, and was now simply waiting, observing and recording the results. The first tremor of the earthquake I had unleashed would likely not be felt by Mark directly. It would be a silent digital event. A series of automated notifications firing between banking systems. The mortgage underwriter for the $3 million mansion would be the first to know that their star client was not who he appeared to be. The clean, healthy financial statement he had submitted was now a toxic asset. A lie that would unravel his entire application. But the aftershocks, those would be felt by Mark and Chloe in their snowy 5-star paradise. They would be blissfully unaware, ordering room service, perhaps planning their next extravagant purchase. They were living in the final beautiful sunlit moments before the tsunami of consequences. A wave of their own making came crashing down upon their perfect stolen vacation. I thought about calling him. I thought about giving him a warning, a final chance to come clean, to confess. But I knew it would be useless. He would just lie more, dig himself deeper, try to manipulate me further. He had shown me who he was. My job now was not to save him, but to simply allow him to face the natural, logical, and devastating consequences of his own actions. I had designed his financial life to be a beautiful, self-sustaining structure, all supported by a single hidden foundation. He had just taken a sledgehammer to that foundation. And I, the architect, was about to watch with a clean conscience as the entire rotten edifice came tumbling down. The first crack in their perfect, stolen world appeared, as I had suspected it would, in a temple of consumerism. Aspen is a town that runs on old money and new credit. It is a place where the simple act of shopping is a competitive sport, and the flash of a high-limit credit card is a statement of one's place in the hierarchy. The story came to me later, pieced together from a series of frantic, tearful voicemails from Chloe to a friend. Voicemails that the friend, who had long since grown tired of Chloe's narcissism, would eventually forward to me with a single gleeful word: karma. It was Tuesday morning, the second day of their victory tour. They were in one of Aspen's most exclusive ski boutiques, a place where a simple pair of goggles could cost more than a monthly mortgage payment. Chloe, in her element, had gathered an armful of extravagant designer ski wear, a sleek white Bogner ski suit, a fur-lined helmet, a pair of outrageously expensive Chanel sunglasses. She was holding court at the cash register, her voice loud enough for everyone in the small hushed store to hear. "Just a few little things to get me through the week," she had announced to the sales associate, a woman with a face frozen by a combination of Botox and a deep professional disdain for tourists like Chloe. The total came to just over $12,000. Chloe, without flinching, had presented her American Express Platinum card, the one she called her serious shopping card. It was the first time she had tried to use it since I had sent the Code Nightingale text. The sales associate swiped it. A moment of silence. She swiped it again. A small, discreet frown touched her lips. "I'm sorry, madam," she had said, her voice a low, humiliating murmur. "This card has been declined." Chloe had laughed. A high, brittle sound of disbelief. "That's impossible. Try it again. Your machine must be broken." The associate tried it again. The result was the same. "The error message says to contact the issuing bank," she said, her voice now as cold as the snow outside. The first flush of humiliation had appeared on Chloe's cheeks. The other wealthy patrons in the store had started to notice, their eyes flicking over, sensing the delicious minor drama. "Fine," Chloe had snapped, her voice losing its breezy confidence. She had rummaged in her purse and produced the Visa Black card. "Try this one." The result was identical. "Declined. Contact bank." The blood had drained from Chloe's face. This was not just an inconvenience. It was a public shaming. It was a catastrophic failure of the very system that defined her identity. In a world where you are what you can buy, she had just been rendered a non-entity. Mark, who had been trying on a garish bright orange ski jacket, had come over, his face a mask of confusion. "What's wrong, babe?" "These stupid machines are broken," Chloe had hissed, her voice a low, furious whisper. "Neither of the cards are working." The sales associate, a veteran of 1,000 such Aspen meltdowns, had simply looked at them with an expression of profound, bored indifference. "Perhaps you'd like to try a debit card?" she had suggested. The words a final, devastating insult. They had left the store empty-handed, the pile of expensive ski wear abandoned on the counter. They had stumbled out into the bright, cold mountain air, the beautiful sunny day now a mocking witness to their sudden, inexplicable financial impotence. The first crack had appeared, and the entire fragile structure of their stolen dream was about to come crashing down. The humiliation in the ski boutique was a deep and painful wound to Chloe's ego, but for Mark it was just an annoyance, a logistical problem to be solved. He was still operating under the blissful, arrogant assumption that this was a simple technical glitch, a mistake on the bank's end that a quick, authoritative phone call from him would resolve. He was, after all, a man of means, a startup guru on the verge of closing the deal of a lifetime. A declined credit card was a temporary inconvenience, not a symptom of a terminal disease. He spent the rest of the afternoon on the phone in their opulent hotel suite, a suite that was costing more per night than he earned in a week. I can picture him pacing the thick, plush carpet, his voice growing increasingly frustrated as he was bounced from one automated menu to another, from one unhelpful customer service representative to the next. "What do you mean the primary account is closed?" he would have demanded. "That's impossible. My mother would have told me." "What do you mean my spending privileges have been suspended?" "I am a platinum card holder." He was a king, shouting commands in a kingdom that no longer recognized his authority. The system I had created, The system that had propped him up for years was now a cold, impenetrable wall. He had no access, no authority, no power. He was for the first time in his adult life, on his own. His frustration, I am sure, curdled into a genuine dawning panic. But he was a performer, and the show had to go on. He couldn't let Chloe or her mother see his fear. He had to maintain the illusion of control, of success. So that evening, he did what he always did when faced with a problem. He threw money at it, or rather he attempted to. He made a reservation at Aspen's most exclusive and notoriously expensive restaurant, a place where the tasting menu was a four-figure affair. It was a grand, desperate gesture of defiance, an attempt to prove to his audience, and to himself that the boutique incident was a fluke, that his world was still intact. The dinner, as described in Chloe's tearful voicemails, was a tense, miserable affair. The food was exquisite, the wine was rare, but the atmosphere was thick with unspoken anxiety. Chloe was sullen and silent, still smarting from her public shaming. Brenda was trying to maintain a cheerful, oblivious facade, her loud laughter echoing strangely in the hushed, reverent dining room. And Mark was a coiled spring of tension, his eyes constantly darting around the room, his charming smile a tight, painful grimace. The moment of truth arrived with the bill. It was a staggering sum, presented in a discreet, leather-bound folio. This was the moment Mark had planned to redeem himself, to reassert his position as the powerful, successful provider. With a flourish of forced, nonchalant confidence, he pulled out his own personal credit card, the one linked to his own, now nearly empty, checking account. He had likely assumed that the $281,000 he had transferred from my account was already there. A massive, comforting cushion. He had no idea that a wire transfer of that size would be subject to a multi-day hold for security checks. My money was in limbo, inaccessible, and his own account was running on fumes. He handed the card to the waiter. The waiter, a polished professional, walked away to run it. The few minutes he was gone must have felt like an eternity to my son. When the waiter returned, his expression was a perfect, polite mask of professional regret. He leaned down and spoke to Mark in a low, mortifying whisper that was nonetheless audible to both Chloe and Brenda. "I'm terribly sorry, sir," the waiter murmured. "This card has also been declined." The second crack was a seismic event. The boutique was one thing. This was another. This was the main event, the grand gesture, and it had ended in the same soul-crushing humiliation. Mark's bravado, his entire performance as a man of means, evaporated into the cold, thin mountain air. Chloe's voicemail described the scene with a kind of hysterical, morbid detail. Mark had turned a blotchy, furious red. He had tried to argue with the waiter, his voice a low, panicked hiss. He had tried to call his bank, but it was after hours. They were trapped, a table of supposed high rollers, unable to pay their bill at one of the most expensive restaurants in the country. The end was a symphony of shame. Mark had been forced to make a phone call to a business partner, a pathetic, desperate call to one of his few actual friends, begging him to read his own credit card number over the phone to the restaurant manager. They had slunk out of the restaurant, their heads bowed, the eyes of the other diners following them like daggers. The dream vacation had become a nightmare. The celebration had become a wake. And my son, my brilliant, arrogant son, was finally beginning to understand that the world he had built was nothing more than a beautiful, expensive, and now completely collapsed house of cards. The humiliation at the restaurant was the first tremor Mark felt directly, but the main earthquake was happening silently, digitally, thousands of miles away in Atlanta. While he was grappling with the shame of a declined credit card, the automated systems that governed his life were systematically dismantling his entire existence. The first email had arrived in his inbox while he was at dinner, a cold, clinical notification from the leasing company of his Buckhead condo. Subject: urgent, payment failure, lease agreement, M742. Dear Mr. Jennings, this email is to inform you that the automated rental payment for your unit, scheduled for today's date, has failed due to insufficient funds from the listed source account. As per the terms of your lease agreement, a failed payment constitutes a breach of contract. A late fee has been assessed. Please be advised that if the full balance, including the late fee, is not remitted within 3 business days, eviction proceedings will be initiated. He would have seen it when he got back to the hotel, his stomach still churning with the shame of the restaurant fiasco. The message would have been a jolt of pure, cold panic. The condo was the centerpiece of his life, the stage for his entire performance. The thought of being evicted, of losing that symbol of his success, would have been terrifying. He likely would have dismissed it as part of the same bank glitch, a problem that would resolve itself in the morning when he could get a real person on the phone. But the digital blows kept coming. An hour later, another email arrived, this one from the financing company for his Escalade. Subject: final notice. Payment default. Accountant 99B4512. Dear Mr. Jennings, we are writing to inform you that your monthly lease payment has been rejected. The source account provided has been reported as closed by the primary holder. This constitutes a severe breach of your financing agreement. You are hereby in default. We require immediate payment of the full outstanding balance. If payment is not received within 48 hours, we will initiate repossession of the vehicle. Please be aware that a repossession will be reported to all 3 major credit bureaus and will have a severe and lasting impact on your credit score. This message would have hit him harder. The Escalade was more than just a car. It was his armor. It was the physical manifestation of his success. The thing that proved to the world that he was a man to be taken seriously. The word repossession would have been a dagger to his ego. He was not the kind of man whose car got repossessed. That happened to other people, to failures. I can picture him in that ridiculously expensive hotel suite, the stunning mountain view outside the window a mocking contrast to the ugly digital ruin unfolding on his phone screen. Chloe and her mother would be in the other room, a toxic cloud of blame and recrimination, and he would be alone staring at these messages, the walls of his carefully constructed world caving in around him. He was a man who had built his life on a single faulty pillar. My money, and now that the pillar had been removed, the entire structure was coming down with a speed and a finality that he could not have possibly anticipated. He still wouldn't have understood the full scope of it. He would have been clinging to the one great hope he had left, the $3 million mansion. He would have told himself that this was all just a temporary, albeit catastrophic cash flow problem. Once the mortgage was approved, once he and Chloe were in that magnificent house, all of this would be forgotten. The house was his salvation, his ticket to a new, unassailable level of success. He was like a man on a sinking ship, his eyes fixed on a distant, beautiful island, completely unaware that the island itself was a mirage. The final fatal blow would not come in the form of an angry email. It would be a quiet, internal and utterly devastating event. Somewhere in a sterile office park in Charlotte, a mortgage underwriter performing their final due diligence on the Jennings application would get an automated high-priority alert from their system. The alert would be brutally simple. The primary asset account listed as proof of funds by the applicant had been flagged for suspicious activity, specifically a full and total liquidation. The underwriter would look at the original statement, showing a healthy balance of over $250,000. Then they would look at the new updated data, showing a balance of 0. The proof of funds had vanished. The entire foundation of the mortgage application had been a lie. The application would not just be denied. It would be flagged as a potential case of mortgage fraud. Mark's name would be entered into a shared database of high-risk applicants. He hadn't just lost the house. He had lost the ability to ever buy another one. He wouldn't know it yet. He would be sleeping a fitful nightmare-filled sleep in his 5-star bed in Aspen, dreaming of his mansion on the hill, but the foundation had already crumbled to dust. The sun was about to rise on the first day of his new ruined life. The final domino fell not with a crash, but with the quiet sterile chime of an incoming email. It was a sound that Mark would likely associate with the end of his world for the rest of his life. He and Chloe and Brenda were, according to the later voicemails, in the hotel lobby. Their grand plans for the day: a private ski lesson for Chloe, a spa day for Brenda, a business call for Mark, had been indefinitely postponed. They were in a state of suspended panicked animation, waiting for the banks on the East Coast to open for Mark to make the phone call that would magically fix everything. They were a small miserable island of designer luggage and simmering resentment in the middle of the morning bustle of the opulent lobby. Mark was on his laptop, frantically refreshing his online banking portal, his face a mask of grim, sweaty concentration. He was waiting for the $281,000 to appear, the magical infusion of cash that would solve all his problems. And then, at precisely 9:02 a.m. Eastern Time, the email arrived. It was from the real estate agent for the Buckhead mansion, a slick, aggressive man who had been his co-conspirator in the fantasy of his new life. The subject line was a stark, brutal death sentence: urgent deal termination, 452 West Paces Ferry. Mark's hands would have been trembling as he clicked it open. The email was short, cold, and utterly devoid of the chummy congratulatory tone the agent had used in all his previous communications. Mark, I just received a call from the mortgage underwriter. Your financing has been denied due to a catastrophic failure in your proof of funds verification. The lender has flagged the application for fraudulent activity. As a result of this financing failure, you are in breach of contract. The sellers have been notified, and they are exercising their right to terminate the deal. The property is being placed back on the market effective immediately. As per the terms of the agreement you signed, your deposit is non-refundable in the event of a breach of this nature. I'm sorry, Mark. The deal is dead. You've lost the house, and you've lost your deposit. I can picture the scene with perfect architectural clarity, the color draining from my son's face, the laptop screen reflecting the look of pure slack-jawed horror in his eyes, the $281,000 my life savings, the money he had stolen, the foundation of his entire desperate greedy plan was gone. He hadn't just failed to secure his new life, he had actively paid $250,000 for the privilege of having it spectacularly destroyed. The phone was in his hand before he had even finished processing the email. His fingers shaking with a rage born of pure abject panic, dialed my number. He wasn't calling for an explanation. He was calling to find a target for the catastrophic failure of his own making. I was at the Atlanta Botanical Garden when he called. It was a beautiful crisp autumn morning, and I was sitting on a bench overlooking the Japanese garden, a place of serene, contemplative beauty. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and pine. I was at peace. The shrill, angry buzz of my phone was a violent intrusion. I looked at the caller ID. Jamal? No, Mark. I had to remember to call him Mark. Jamal was the little boy. Mark was the man who had made these choices. I answered, my voice calm. Hello, Mark. The sound that erupted from the other end of the line was not a voice. It was a raw, animalistic scream of pure, undiluted rage and despair. What did you do? He shrieked, the sound so distorted with fury that it was barely human. I held the phone away from my ear, waiting for the initial wave to pass. I looked at the koi pond, at the gentle, graceful movements of the brightly colored fish. They moved with a purpose and a quiet dignity that my son had never managed to achieve. My mortgage was denied, he screamed, his voice cracking, devolving into a desperate sobbing wail. The deal is dead. I lost the deposit. I lost everything. You did this. You ruined my life. I hate you. The words, which should have shattered my heart, landed with a strange, quiet thud. They had no power over me anymore. They were just noise, the desperate, flailing death rattle of the hold he had once had over me. I waited for his sobs to subside into ragged, gasping breaths. And then, in the quiet, peaceful air of the garden, I finally responded. I let his final guttural "I hate you" hang in the air for a long moment. A toxic, ugly cloud, dissipating into the clean, crisp morning. I looked at the meticulously raked sand of the Zen garden, a perfect, orderly landscape of cause and effect. A stone is dropped, and the ripples spread. My son had just dropped a boulder on his own life, and he was now screaming at me for getting wet. Are you finished? I asked, my voice not unkind, but utterly devoid of the maternal sympathy he was expecting. It was the calm, dispassionate voice of an architect reviewing a failed stress test. Finished, he sputtered, his voice thick with tears and rage. You destroyed my life, my one big shot, and you destroyed it. Why? Why would you do that to me? I did nothing, Mark, I said, my voice as calm and as steady as the ancient Japanese maple in front of me. You are the one who has been very, very busy. I have simply been observing. Observing? What are you talking about? He demanded. Let's review the chain of events, shall we? I said, my tone shifting into the familiar patient cadence of a teacher explaining a complex problem to a particularly slow student. On Sunday, you came to my home and you lied to me. You invented a story about a startup to manipulate your mother into giving you what you believed to be her entire life savings. There was a choked, sputtering sound on his end. Then, I continued, my voice unwavering, in the early hours of Monday morning, you did not take the loan you asked for. You logged into my account, and you stole every single cent, like a common thief in the night, an act of profound greed and betrayal. I was going to pay it back, he insisted, his voice a pathetic, childish whine. Were you? I asked, a hint of steel entering my voice. You then took that stolen money and you immediately used it as a fraudulent deposit on a $3 million house you could not possibly afford. You submitted my bank statements to a mortgage lender, pretending my savings were your own. That is a federal crime, Mark. It's called mortgage fraud. The silence on his end was now absolute. The bluster, the rage, It had all been replaced by the cold dawning horror of a man who is just beginning to understand the true depth of the hole he has dug for himself. And then, I said, my voice softening into a tone of almost clinical pity, you took your wife and her mother on a celebratory first-class vacation to Aspen, a trip you paid for with credit cards that are ultimately my responsibility. You broadcast your theft to the world on social media, a display of arrogance so profound it's almost poetic. I let him absorb the full, ugly weight of his own actions, a litany of his own sins. So you see, Mark, I concluded, my voice gentle but with the finality of a judge delivering a sentence, I did not call the mortgage company, I did not call the credit card companies, I did not call the leasing agent for your condo or your car, I did nothing at all. I paused, letting the final devastating truth land. You did, I said. You drained the account. You emptied the well that was the sole source of funding for your entire artificial life. You showed the bank, the credit card companies, and your mortgage lender exactly who you are. A man with no assets, no income and no integrity. All I did, my son, was finally decide not to stop you. I simply stepped out of the way, and allowed you to face the natural, logical consequences of your own choices. The only sound on the other end of the line was the ragged, broken sound of his breathing. The angry, screaming child was gone, replaced by a terrified man who was finally for the first time in his life completely and utterly on his own. You called it a demolition, James, I murmured into the phone later that day. I was back in my study, the late afternoon sun streaming through the windows. It seems an appropriate term, he replied, his voice a dry professional hum. The final reports are in. It's a clean sweep. His credit lines are frozen, his leases are in default, and his name is now on a list at the Mortgage Bankers Association that will ensure he won't be able to get a home loan until the sun burns out. It was a quiet but total demolition. Thank you, James, I said, for everything. It was my pleasure, Sarah, he said, and I knew he meant it. Just say the word, and I'll start the process of recovering the deposit. No, I said, a new clear purpose forming in my mind. Leave the money where it is for now. I have a different kind of architectural project in mind for it. The demolition of Mark's financial life was a silent, digital event that had taken place in sterile server rooms and anonymous office parks. But the fallout, the messy human consequences of that demolition was about to become very loud and very public. For Mark, Chloe and Brenda, the five-star resort in Aspen had transformed from a celebratory paradise into a luxurious high-altitude prison. The news of the failed mortgage had been the death blow to their dreams, but the immediate practical nightmare was just beginning. Their credit cards, their only means of survival in a world where a bottle of water from the minibar costs $15, were now useless pieces of plastic. The large incidental hold the hotel had placed on their primary card upon check-in had been declined, and the hotel management had been alerted. The first sign of their new, downgraded status came that afternoon, a polite but firm knock on the door of their suite. It was a junior manager from the front desk, his face a mask of professional regret. He had explained that due to a problem with their card on file, all room charging privileges had been suspended. If they wished to order room service or a drink from the bar, or even rent a movie, they would need to pay in cash, up front. Cash, of course, was something they did not have. They were modern, affluent people who lived in a world of digital transactions and credit. They probably hadn't carried more than $100 in cash between the three of them. They were trapped in a gilded cage, surrounded by a level of luxury they could no longer afford to even touch. The beautiful opulent prison was a constant mocking reminder of the life that had just been snatched away from them. The arguments, as recounted in Chloe's increasingly hysterical voicemails to her friend, were epic. The blame flew like shrapnel in the confines of the $1,000 a night suite. Chloe and Brenda, a formidable alliance of entitlement, turned on Mark. It was his fault. He had screwed up, he had failed them. Mark, his ego already shattered, had apparently tried to fight back, blaming Chloe's insatiable spending, her constant need for more for pushing him into this desperate situation. It was a toxic, ugly meltdown, the inevitable implosion of a relationship built on a foundation of lies and materialism. The true final humiliation came the next morning. It was checkout day. Their glorious week-long vacation had been cut short. They couldn't afford another night, but they also couldn't afford to leave. They stood at the front desk, a trio of well-dressed refugees, as the hotel manager presented them with the bill. It was a staggering sum, a testament to their gluttony. The 2 nights at the rack rate, the extravagant dinner at the restaurant, The room service champagne they had ordered to celebrate their victory. They had no way to pay it. I can picture the scene with a grim satisfaction. The hushed, elegant lobby of the Aspen Resort. My son, the startup guru, and his glamorous wife, the influencer, standing there utterly defeated, their faces a mixture of shame and fury, as the manager coolly informed them that they would not be permitted to leave until the bill was settled. He had of course offered to call the police to help mediate the dispute. They were stranded, not on a deserted island, but in a far crueler place, a paradise they could see, could touch, could smell, but could no longer be a part of. They were on the outside looking in, a position they had so callously and so often relegated me to. The irony was as sharp and as cold as the mountain air. They had no money for the hotel bill. They had no money for a taxi to the airport. And they certainly had no money for 3 last-minute, one-way flights back to Atlanta. They were trapped, and there was only one person in the world they could call for a bailout. The call came 2 days after their financial world had ended. 2 days they had likely spent in a state of escalating panic, trapped in their hotel suite, the bill growing with every passing hour. 2 days of frantic failed calls to their friends, who had suddenly become unavailable when the request turned to money. 2 days of their self-worth being stripped away, layer by painful layer, until all that was left was the raw, ugly core of their desperation. It was not Mark who called. His pride, what little he had left of it, would not allow him to. It was Chloe. Her voice, usually so full of a sharp, brittle confidence, was a weak, trembling thing, stripped of all its artifice. The queen had been deposed, and she was calling to beg. "Sarah?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "It's Chloe." "I know who it is," I said, my voice not unkind, but not warm either. It was neutral, the voice of a banker discussing a defaulted loan. The words tumbled out of her in a messy, tearful torrent. She told me everything, painting a picture of a nightmare scenario. The hotel was threatening to have them arrested. They were trapped. They had no money. They had no way to get home. She was sorry. It was all a terrible mistake. Mark was a mess. Brenda was hysterical. She was not sorry for the betrayal, for the theft, for the lies. She was sorry she had gotten caught. She was sorry her perfect curated life had imploded. But her apology, as insincere as it was not what I was listening for. I was listening for the sound of her surrender, and it was absolute. "Please, Sarah," she finally wept, her voice a pathetic, broken whisper. "We'll do anything. Just get us home." "I see," I said, letting the silence stretch, letting her hang in the void of her own making. "You require transportation from Aspen, Colorado to Atlanta, Georgia for 3 adults. "Yes," she sobbed. "Please." "I am willing to provide that," I said, my voice all business. "However, after recent events, I am no longer in a position to fund your first-class lifestyle. My life savings have, as you know, been liquidated." There was a choked, strangled sound on her end. "But I will get you home," I continued. "I will wire just enough money to the hotel to settle the outstanding balance for your accommodations. And I will arrange for your transportation. You will receive an email confirmation with your tickets shortly." A wave of profound, desperate relief washed through her voice. "Oh, thank you, Sarah. Thank you. I knew you wouldn't abandon us." "I am not abandoning you, Chloe," I said, my voice as cold and as clear as ice. "I am teaching you a lesson in economics. Check your email." I hung up the phone. A few minutes later, in that 5-star hotel lobby in Aspen, Chloe's phone would have chimed. The email confirmation would have arrived, but it would not have been for 3 first-class seats on a direct flight to Atlanta. It would have been for 3 one-way tickets on a Greyhound bus. The journey from Aspen to Atlanta by bus is not a simple one. It is a multi-day odyssey, a descent from the rarefied air of a mountain paradise into the gritty, unglamorous heart of the country. It is a journey of endless rumbling miles, of sticky vinyl seats, of questionable roadside diners, and of fellow passengers whose life stories are etched onto their weary faces. It was, in short, the perfect antidote to their lives of insulated first-class privilege. It was a forced immersion into the very world they had always believed themselves to be above. I pictured them, my 3 fallen aristocrats, boarding that bus. Their designer luggage, so out of place, would be shoved into the grimy compartment below. They would find their seats, the air thick with the smell of diesel and disinfectant, and for the next 3 days they would be forced to sit, to wait, and to reflect. They would have no phones to distract them, their data plans long since cancelled for non-payment. They would have no social media to curate, No audience to perform for. They would have nothing but the endless unspooling ribbon of the American highway and the company of their own bitter resentful thoughts. It was a humiliating, exhausting, and deeply educational journey. And as they rumbled across the plains, humbled and defeated, I knew that the lesson had only just begun. The final, most brutal part of their education was waiting for them at home. They arrived in Atlanta on a dreary, rain-soaked Friday morning, 3 days after I had sent them their tickets. They would have stumbled off the bus at the downtown terminal, their expensive clothes rumpled and stained, their faces pale with exhaustion and a deep soul-crushing shame. The city they had once seen as their kingdom, their playground, would now look alien and hostile. They would have had to pool the last of their cash to take a taxi back to their trendy Buckhead condo, the one place they still believed was their sanctuary, their last remaining foothold in the life they had lost. The journey from the gritty reality of the bus station to the manicured perfection of their neighborhood would have been a final cruel reminder of the world they had been so violently ejected from. But the final, most brutal lesson was waiting for them on the front door. Taped to the sleek modern wood of their condo door, flapping slightly in the damp breeze, would be a bright, unignorable piece of paper. It was an eviction notice, a formal, legal declaration that their lease had been terminated due to a severe and unrectified breach of contract. It would have given them 48 hours to vacate the premises. The key they had would not have worked. The locks would have already been changed. As they stood there staring at the notice, their last hope crumbling to dust, another figure would have emerged from the shadows of the parking garage, a man in a simple work uniform, holding a clipboard. "Are you Mark Jennings?" he would have asked, his voice a flat, bureaucratic monotone. Mark, dumbstruck, would have just nodded. "I'm here from the financing company," the man would have said. Not unkindly, "I'm here to repossess the Escalade. I just need you to hand over the keys." It was the final, complete, and total erasure of their life of illusion. Their home was gone, their car was gone, their credit was destroyed, their future, the one they had been so certain of, was a blank, terrifying void. They were left with nothing but a few suitcases of designer clothes, standing in the rain on the curb of a life that was no longer theirs. Months later, the dust had settled. Mark and Chloe, I had heard through the grapevine, had been forced to move in with Brenda. The three of them crowded into her small, gaudy condo, a toxic petri dish of blame and recrimination. Mark had lost his job. His name was mud in the small insular world of Atlanta's tech scene. They were for the first time in their lives truly on their own, and they were failing spectacularly. I never heard from them directly again. The silence was a gift. One sunny spring morning, I found myself in a different kind of meeting. I was at Georgia Tech in the office of the Dean of the College of Architecture. Across the desk from me sat a bright-eyed, fiercely intelligent young woman, a brilliant student from a low-income background who was on the verge of dropping out due to financial hardship. I had the paperwork with me prepared by James. I had recovered the $250,000 from the real estate company. My threat of a lawsuit for their complicity in the mortgage fraud had been a powerful motivator. The money sat in my account, a tainted, ugly reminder of my son's greed. I had decided to turn that poison into a cure. "I've been following your work, Maria," I said, my voice warm. "Your designs have a wonderful sense of integrity, of a solid foundation." She blushed, a modest, grateful young woman with a talent that deserved to be nurtured. "I would like to help," I continued. I slid the folder across the desk to the dean. "I am endowing a new scholarship. The Foundation Scholarship. It will be a full-ride scholarship, awarded each year to a promising student who needs a little help building their own future." I looked at Maria, at her bright, hopeful face, and I saw the future, not the one my son had tried to steal, but a better one, a real one. "And I would like for you," I said, my voice thick with a new, joyful emotion, "to be its first recipient." The dean opened the folder and looked at the certified check inside. His eyes widened. It was for the full amount, $281,472.19. I had turned my son's greed into a foundation. I had taken the wreckage of my own family and used it to build something that would last. Something with integrity. Something that would help a new generation of architects create a better, more beautiful world. It was the best design I had ever created.